Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Joining us today is Michael Mechanic. He is senior editor at Mother Jones Magazine, and he is the author of Jackpot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
So I came across an article an interview actually that you did recently, and it was about the problems of poverty and inequality in America. And knew immediately I wanted to have you on because I want to have disparate viewpoints come on the show so we can have interesting discussions and people can see all the ideas. So the main two things that I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you have an issue with are poverty and the massive wealth disparities between the rich and the poor. Would that be an accurate depiction of your view?
Yeah, well, I mean, those are two sides of the same coin, right?
Yes.
Where, there's deprivation on one end, there's sort of support of the accumulation of wealth on the other. And so my subject in that interview is Matthew Desmond, who was a sociologist at Princeton. He wrote a book called Poverty by America, and he won a Pulitzer previously for his book called Evicted, in which he basically spent a lot of time with poor families who are always under threat of eviction. And, it was a very narrative style book. This book is a little bit more based on his idea that poverty is not inevitable, that it's our policies that create it, and that we can solve the problem, which, I think reasonable people believe is, a problem in America, especially extreme poverty, where people are just, have nothing and they're sick and they're dying and they're very insecure in terms of food and housing and so forth. And he's basically saying that's a solvable problem if we find the political will and look carefully at ourselves and say that we're all sort of complicit in it in a way.
So would you say that inequality per se is the problem? That if you have massive wealth disparities, that is a problem? Or is it that people are, as you just said, they're very poor, they're going without health care, they're hungry? Is that the problem?
Well, they're both problems. I mean, inequality is in itself it's inevitable. I mean, Andrew Carnegie used to say this, right? But it's really a matter of degree, right? As I wrote in my book, it's like, okay, you have the guy sweeping the floor in the warehouse and you have the CEO. And of course, you're going to pay the CEO a higher salary than the guy sweeping the floor in the warehouse. The question is, how much more, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it 10 times more? Is it 50 times, 100, 1,000? At what point, does being in that leadership position give you the ability to just collect ludicrous amounts of money, and where these other guys, minimum wage, which we know has been stagnant in America at like $7.25 an hour, at least on the federal level.
So you kind of stack the deck there when you use terms like ludicrous, because it already, without establishing as a fact, paints it as such. This is where the argument that inequality is a problem breaks down for me. Suppose that the bottom 50% of the country right now lived as Bill Gates does, and the top 1% lived, say, 1,000 times better than they did. You would have massive wealth inequality there, but I don't see how that would be a problem, because people then would be living what now we consider the super rich to be living. So how can inequality in and of itself be an issue?
Okay, well, that's a good point. Inequality is an issue when we have so much deprivation.
So poverty, that's what I was getting to. So poverty is actually what the issue is.
But it's also an issue of the sort of concentration of power in very few hands, which I think is really bad in a democratic society. I actually had lunch with a guy, an old Berkeley lefty, the other day. He had read my book and wanted to talk to me about a book he was writing. And it sounded like a very kind of idealistic sort of anti-capitalist book, but he did make a point that was interesting. And that was, the founders in the Constitution, they really, they were kind of prescient in a lot of ways. And they set up certain guardrails, the separation of powers, special protections for journalism, because journalism kind of puts checks on corruption. And he said what they did not address in the Constitution is the fact that commercial interests could gain too much power and kind of suck everything into their vortex. And I thought that was kind of interesting observation, because that's sort of what we're seeing. There's so much, the wealth has sort of become the black hole, and it's very hard for, we see how our elections are swayed by wealth, and we see how all the attention gets paid to the ideas of people with extremely large resources. So you kind of have that, and I think about a guy like Musk, right? He's a smart guy. Obviously, he's built a lot of things, but there's sort of this hubris among the people who've accumulated vast wealth that they know how to solve all the problems. And they also have so much power. They have political power because they can call their senators, and the senators are going to return their calls. They have great philanthropic power, which, by the way, is subsidized by the government with large tax breaks, and it's subsidized in a way that you and I don't know what your wealth is, but most people, 90% of the people, don't itemize on their taxes, so they're not getting a tax break for charitable donations. Whereas if you have all this money, you have $1 billion, and you put 100 million towards charity, only 20% or so of that is subsidized by the government. And if you put that in a donor advised fund, it just can sit there forever. And this is basically public money that you're sitting on, and you can direct towards whatever purposes you want. So, I'm not saying philanthropy is bad. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying it does concentrate more power in the hands of people with a lot of resources.
All right, so there's two things that you said in there that kind of caught my attention. The first thing, when you're talking about the power that the super wealthy have, and you mentioned their sway over politicians. So are you talking about the power that they have basically to bribe politicians? Maybe it's not done in the form of, here, I'll give you this, you give me that, but they can donate large sums of money to politicians, and then politicians can steer legislation in directions that are favorable to them.
That's right.
That's accurate?
Yeah, but it's not even necessarily on an individual level, but on a group level. There's been research on this that shows that people who are, I guess, 1%ers and up have a lot more contact with politicians and regulators and so on than most people do. They also have much more confidence that they will be heeded and listened to. And then when you look at the policies that come out of that, they tend to go more in favor, the policy interests are aligned with the very wealthy more than the public. They kind of looked at, here are the policy preferences of the public, and the policy preferences of the wealthy are different. Even, liberal wealthy, right? Mm-hmm. For instance, like with public schooling, a lot of, most very wealthy people send their kids to private school. And so there's less caring for public education. And that's reflected in the surveys.
Okay. This is, again, another area where with progressives kind of drive me a little crazy, because the argument is that the politicians basically are corrupt, that they're capable of being bought by the very wealthy. They give favors to the very wealthy because they give them contributions. They'll answer their phone calls. They'll get back to them right away. They'll give them their time. So we're arguing that we have a corrupt government, but then the progressive solution is to give them more power. I don't understand how that solves anything. If we concede they're corrupt and then we say give them more power, it seems like we're giving more power to corrupt people.
I'm sorry, what do you mean give them more power?
Okay, for instance, if the government is raising taxes they have more power. That's more power to extract money from people. Or if they are in control of the healthcare system, that's more power. If they're passing laws in terms of minimum wage laws or workplace safety laws or any of the abundance of other regulations that they pass, or their oversight of Wall Street, anything that's giving them power over these things is increasing the power of corrupt people.
Well, I'm saying that the system becomes corrupted by wealth. I'm not saying that every politician is corrupt, but I mean, you get sort of into that, milieu, and all of a sudden you're being sworn by lobby. You become in a bit of a bubble where the people you are hearing from are the people who represent special interests, wealthy interests often. Whereas the government as a whole, if you could take some of the money, the influence of money out of that system, government as a whole is, I mean, I don't know exactly what the libertarian view is, but in my view, government is to, it's for the common good and to pursue things in the common interest. And it's interesting because there's a guy named, his last name Joseph Ellis, he's a Pulitzer Prize winning historian.
Yeah, he writes a lot of books about the fathers of the country, right?
Yeah, and he wrote a really interesting book called American Dialogue. And a whole section of it was about, which I talk about it a little bit in my book, was there was a series of letters between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in their later years, and they were just debating about all these sorts of things. And Adams' biggest fear was sort of the accumulation of wealth and the creation of aristocracy in America, which he felt was a massive threat to the new republic. And he had a funny solution. He thought the Senate was just sort of a joke. And he said, we'll give these people, he was thinking a little bit of the House of Lords, it was like, we'll give these people ceremonial positions. We'll put them in the Senate where they can do no harm. It amused me in this day and age. But, he said, unless it's reined in, wealth will just roll up like a snowball and kind of take over everything. And Jefferson was, oh no, the laws in the new country that, they didn't have the same kind of inheritance laws as they did in England. The aristocracy will kind of fade away.
Well, he believed in natural aristocracy. Jefferson.
Well, I mean, Jefferson had issues. Right?
Well, he did, but I mean, you have to kind of, if we're going to put the views out there, Jefferson believed in a natural aristocracy whereby, basically a meritocracy where the best would rise to the top. That's far different from the aristocracy that existed in Great Britain or in France at the time. But I don't. We're getting too much into hereditary.
What we don't want is a hereditary aristocracy. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of counter to, the idea of equal opportunity, which is a very central, it's a central, well, I hesitate to call it a myth, but it becomes one.
Well, I'll call it a myth. It's an impossibility. There's no way everybody can have it. There can be an equality opportunity because people are simply not equal in our natural talents and where we're born and who our parents are, the environment.
Okay, yes, but actually Adams made that point. He said, of course not, right? But that's not what the Declaration said. It said all men are created equal, meaning, of course they have differences in abilities and natural talents and so forth, potential, but that they should be given the same shot at success as the next person. And that, of course, doesn't happen.
So you said something a few minutes ago about that money corrupts politics. But let's say you did away with that. You got the money out of it. Politicians, it seems, still, they want to get elected. And to get elected, they're going to cater to whichever group is going to get them elected. I mean, if you, for instance, they cater to unions. They want to give the unions power. And they get the union vote for that. That's one of the Democrats, lobby. So by passing legislation in favor of the unions, they get votes. These aren't necessarily votes that are wholesome or that are to their core beliefs. It's about power. So it seems to me that no matter what you do, as far as that goes, politicians and people that elect them will always find a way to be corrupt, which is why in this country, they went to such pains to restrict their power. But as long as they have power to sell, they're going to sell it, whether it's for money or something else, a vote. So my point here is, again, back to the progressive sort of belief in the government's ability to solve problems. In order to solve many of these problems, they want to give the government power. Now, there's a great article called Unicorn Governance by a guy named Michael Munger. And he said, whenever somebody tells you that they want the government to do X, Y, or Z, put in the place of the word government the politicians that you actually know, your local congressman or your local selectman, whatever, and then come back and tell me if that's what you want. And it seems to me the answer would be no. I don't want Ted Cruz, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump getting together to solve anything. I don't trust any of them. And it seems to me that is ignored by the very people who complain about corruption in government when they advocate giving more power to government, which is the way that you would go about. I'm getting ahead of myself, but I think you would say to solve the problems that you're addressing or you're talking about.
Well, I mean, the government is always, I mean, one of the big roles of government is to collect money and allocate it in a way that sort of takes care of, well, both, in the national defense, but also, to help people who really need help. Again, it's like the common good. And so in a way, our tax code becomes sort of, it's I call it a moral document. It's really a document that lays out our priorities as a society. And of course, we are going to fight over those all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, anyone who expects government to act like a startup, is going to be sadly mistaken, because government is slow and tedious and grinding, and I think it always has been, because since the very beginning, there was never one big happy family. It was always like intense disagreement, including among the founders. And so government is designed to just move slowly, and we think it's like incredibly inefficient, which it often is, but occasionally it comes along and does something great. Did you ever read Michael Lewis's book, The Fifth Risk?
I have not read it, no. I've heard of Michael Lewis, but I've never read the book.
Well, his latest book was about the pandemic, and it's sort of really, takes a smack at the CDC and how it kind of became this bureaucratic ass-covering organization. But The Fifth Risk looks at when Donald Trump came into office, and what he did was so different from what most incoming presidents do. I mean, during a transition, maybe it's just he wasn't ready because he didn't think he was going to win, but transition is like a big thing. But you send a big crew into every department to kind of debrief and figure out what's been going on, because most of what the government does, we don't really know. Like, it's so vast that nobody can have like a handle on everything the government does. And so each new president sends in, groups into each department and said, let's collect as much information as we can, so we can kind of, whatever is going on, we can either keep it rolling or get rid of it or whatever. And for days, like, nobody would show up to these departments after Trump was elected. Like, just nobody. They were all ready for them. They're like, come on, are you going to come or not? And then one guy would show up and make some snide comments and leave. I mean, it was just sort of mind-boggling. But essentially, the theme of the book was looking at all the things that the government actually does that we never hear about. And sometimes by statute, like, some of the departments have been forbidden from publicizing their successes and the things they accomplish, which is kind of bizarre.
But the word you used earlier wasn't, and I think government's inefficient, but the word you used earlier was about corruption. Was that when there's money, when people are wealthy, the government becomes corrupt because people are able to buy their votes. But what I'm suggesting is that money isn't the only currency by which someone can buy congressmen. You could go speak for them. You could campaign for them. You can just vote for them. You can get your organization to support them. And the more power you give to a government, the more you're going to have that problem of where they're not voting for, like you said, the common good. They're voting based on a constituency. Like Donald Trump, you said he did things differently. I would agree there was a lot differently, but at the same time, he was par for the course. He catered to his constituency, he increased government power, and he blew up the debt. That's something that every president that I've ever paid attention to in my lifetime has done. So in that sense, he's very similar to them. But I wanted to ask you about this, though. What do you believe is the cause of the massive wealth inequality that you reference? What leads to that?
Well, Desmond's argument is that it is sort of the exploitation of low-wage workers is a big part of it. Part of it that I cover in my book is sort of, and he also references this, talks about the welfare state catering more to the affluent than it does to alleviating poverty, which is the case if you look at the tax code and the way people are allowed to take, capital profits and stash them away in ways that they'll never be taxed, including, the inheritance laws, some of which were created almost by accident and are kind of crazy. We have, whether or not you believe in inheritance taxes, we have these trusts called grantor trusts, which the ProPublica recently found that half of the wealthiest people in America are using. And these trusts allow you to basically funnel as much, billions of dollars in the case of Sheldon Adelson to their offspring without paying a dime in tax. No, I have a problem with just sort of the ability to move that kind of money around to people who haven't done anything to deserve it. They're not building anything. They're just, they just happen to be born into the right family. And, again, it comes down to what this country is about. And what this country is about is not aristocracy and dynasty. It's about giving people opportunity to accomplish something and build something. And when you allow one family to just sort of through the generations carry on, incredible wealth and power, and you actually, in fact, you subsidize that by enhancing the profits, like giving tax breaks on the growth of any, capital income.
Okay, so
it goes on and on. If you were to, I could write a whole book on the, the estate industry.
Yeah.
And the funny thing about the grantor trusts is they were kind of created by accident. Congress was trying to rein in another kind of trust that people were kind of abusing to get around inheritance taxes. And this smart lawyer, a guy named Richard Covey, saw this and he said, "Oh my God, they just opened the door to this other thing." And he started marketing it to his clients. And one of them was Alice Walton, who was the sister-in-law of the Walmart founder. And the IRS, he had used it with other clients too, but the IRS challenged her on it and they took it to court and she won. And now everybody uses, they call it the Walton Grat.
Okay. So is your problem that, because you wrote in your book, I read, where you talked about how the super rich pay a lower percentage of taxes on their income than the poor do, right? So
the very, very high end,
the very highest rich. So is your problem that it's inequitable that they pay more, or do you just think that they should pay more? In other words, if it's just if the problem is just that they're paying more, well, then I would say, okay, well, then cut the taxes of the lower percentile and they'll be paying the same. But it seems like to pay for the type of programs that you want, you would have to increase the taxes on the upper echelons. Is that accurate?
Well, they should certainly be paying as much as, the average taxpayer.
Well, that's what I'm saying. You could accomplish that by cutting the taxes of the average taxpayer.
Yeah, you could.
But that
I
wouldn't
mean,
be.
again, it's sort of what, uh, you know, right now, obviously, we have the Republicans in Congress yelling and screaming about deficits, right?
Well, they weren't
And
doing that when Trump was in office. So I
exactly,
mean,
that's
so
that's sort of my
they're
point.
yeah. So I
They
don't really
care
care what they're
about it
saying.
when the other guy's in power,
Yeah,
and that's when they want to cut,
of
cut.
course.
And
Yeah,
meanwhile, when Trump was in power, they massively cut taxes on the upper end.
and blew up
And so they're
the debt.
partially responsible. I mean, obviously, the Democratic spending right now is very high. It
Yeah,
was high coming out of COVID, and it's also high because we've got to deal with the climate problem and massively transform our economy if we want to, I don't have much optimism we're going to accomplish it, but we've got to try
okay.
because it's
So
going to be more expensive down the road not to.
you talked about Dynasty a few moments
Yeah,
ago, and in your book, you had a whole chapter called Dynasty. So I went and
right.
looked this up. So the numbers I came up with this morning are this. According to Fidelity Investments, 88% of millionaires are self-made. 68% of those worth 30 million or more are self-made, according to WealthX, and it was reported by CNBC. And 55.8% of billionaires are self-made. Only 13.3% of billionaires have inherited all their wealth. That doesn't sound like a dynastic problem to me.
Haven't inherited well, they're not inheriting just wealth, but they're inheriting
Well, if
their
88% of
privilege and
millionaires are
connections and so forth.
self-made, that's not there. I mean, that's not inheriting a whole, that's not a whole lot inheriting. I mean, some are
Well,
going to inherit,
honestly,
yes.
self-made is a very squishy term, and it's a self-aggrandizing term. And I actually think I don't believe in the term self-made.
Okay.
I think there. I mean, there are a few situations where somebody came from nothing to everything,
Well, I
but
mean, if they're not
but
inheriting
we
the wealth,
fetishize that.
but
But
if they're not
it's very
inheriting their
rare.
wealth, right? I mean, if we say, I agree. Look, self-made is a very vague term, and a lot of the terms used as I was looking through, Google this morning, are very vague as far as what counts as inheritance or what counts as being self-made. I agree with you, but that argument cuts both ways. So if we're going to argue that those terms are inexact, well, then the term this guy he's not self-made would also be inexact. So to make the claim that it's dynastic would be an inexact description of what's actually occurring. But the bottom line is the studies that they've done, or at least that these two studies that I've cited have done, are showing that the majority of people that are wealthy are not a function of inheritance. So that would undercut the argument that Adams made, and that you and others have made. I've been arguing about this for years, that the wealthy are just inheriting their wealth. It's not true, right?
Oh no, I'm not saying that. I mean, clearly some people have come from being middle class to becoming billionaires, but
Well, the majority. It's not just some. It's the
okay,
majority.
but okay, look, I mean, there's a matter of, I've talked to people for my book who talk about themselves as self-made, but they had solid families. They had cheap college, because you could go to college then. There were Pell Grants. There were just a lot of, especially if you were a white guy, there was just a lot of opportunity. If you were, say, a black woman, forget it, right? It wasn't there.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, like, interestingly,
But then that wouldn't be a
I
family
mean,
dynasty, though. That's the thing. That's the equivocation, because what we were originally talking about is dynastic families. Now you're talking
right.
about a general scheme of society and what they, has been now identified as white privilege. So then you'd be talking about a white dynasty, and that's very different. And that's a different argument to make.
But what I'm saying is, when I look back at my upbringing, I would say it was a middle class upbringing,
Okay.
but but it seemed, because my mom grew up in the Depression,
Mm-hmm.
or sorry, her parents grew up in she was born in the Depression, and so she was a very frugal person. So I always see it. I didn't feel like I was privileged in my childhood, but when I think about it, I really kind of was. You know,
Yeah.
um, we had a home, we had good education, I mean, school was cheap. My dad is a professor. I didn't have to pay to go to college. I didn't have any college debt. I mean, these kinds of things are, passed along privilege, right? And
Well,
yeah, you're talking about
that's different
dynasty.
though. That's different from
I understand,
dynasty.
yeah, because right now you can pass, almost $25 million to your children without paying any taxes.
Yeah.
So I mean, that in itself is kind of crazy to me. Um, I mean that does see, the number of people with over $30 million has grown incredibly. And so all that wealth can get passed along in just such a way, in a sort of dynastic manner. But we're talking about, the Mars family or the DeVoses and things like that, who have become dynasties. I mean, I'm not saying that we have zillions of them, because of course we don't, because they are we can only have so many billionaires, right? But once you get to that level, these people are all passing dynastic wealth along. And should they be able to? Do you think they should be able to?
I do, but that's not really the point. The point that
Yeah.
I'm making here is, has our system as such led to these dynasties? And to the point where it's problematic. And what I mean by problematic, to the point where it's excluding others from being able to enter that realm where only people that are inheriting wealth can get wealthy. That's simply not the case. The majority of people who are wealthy do not come from dynasties.
But a lot of the wealth that we see, I mean, take the Walton family, comes from two things. One is paying very low wages to people and not giving them benefits.
That's different. That I'm
Yeah,
talking
no,
strictly.
but I'm saying
But I'm talking about dynasty
how,
specifically.
right. But I'm saying that is how their wealth grows.
Okay.
And then there are other systems in place, like the charitable lead trust that the Walton family used to enrich its children, in the guise of charity. I mean, there's, again, with the trusts, they're called Jackie O trusts. You can look those
Okay.
up. But the Walton family was incredibly smart about exploiting every one of these, tax breaks, essentially, to amass wealth. And they're doing it at the expense of the government, essentially. So, I mean, if you're libertarian, I don't fully understand libertarianism, but it is like very, very limited government, right?
Yes.
And so, if you believe in free market capitalism, it's not what we got.
No, we've never had.
What we have is essentially a welfare system that favors the wealthy.
Well,
including
you're not
these
going to get an
families.
argument from me about
Yeah.
welfare. Listen, I'm opposed to it, and I'm happy that you said it's not a capitalistic system, because people blame capitalism for the perceived problems in the society. But we've never had capitalism. So in order to figure out what's wrong, you kind of have to extrapolate and figure out which part of the system is causing which problem. But what I really want to dig into is is your argument is essentially a moral argument. You said as much earlier on, that I forgot what the exact words you said about the tax code.
I said the tax code is a moral document.
It's a moral document, yes. And the idea,
so it's a budget, a presidential budget.
In the idea, for instance, that they're exploiting workers, that's a moral argument. You're saying this is morally wrong that they're doing this. So would that be accurate? Are you saying that the way that the ultra wealthy conduct themselves, that society allows them to do this and to cause these harms, you're saying it's unethical?
I think it's unethical. Yeah.
Okay. This is the key now. By what standard? What is the standard of judgment you're using to say something's wrong? And let me just give you a couple examples. Muslims and Jews have their standard. The Muslims take the Quran, the Jews take the Torah. They both books tell them that eating pork is wrong. So by their standard, eating pork is a bad thing to do. Christians don't adhere to that. They adhere to the Golden Rule, for instance, and sort of the Ten Commandments. But that's their moral standard. That's what they look to for moral guidance. So when you make the statement that it's immoral to do these things, by what standard are you relying on to make such a judgment?
Well, I'm not talking about a religious standard here.
No, no, but
Um,
really
and this
ethical
is why
doesn't
we
mean
separate,
religious. Yeah,
church
no.
and state,
I
right?
use those as examples to demonstrate that that's their moral standard. Their moral standard is dependent on religion. Mine isn't. But I'm just
Mhm.
when people make the argument that such and such behavior of a capitalist, for instance, it's immoral that he's accumulating such wealth and that he's underpaying his employees. What standard leads to that judgment? How are you coming to the conclusion that that's immoral behavior?
I just, that's that is my personal ethical belief. Um,
Okay. Now,
that
then
that
this,
but I mean but also, from the point of view of the role, again, back to the role of government,
yes.
to provide for the common good,
Yes, which is
that
also a
people,
moral
okay,
judgment.
okay, sure,
Okay.
yeah, but that you have Walmart employees who have to be on the dole because the because their employer won't pay them sufficiently to live. Um, I mean, look, at some point we have to rely on a sort of a common ethical compass here to
Okay,
say
but there
that
is, we
that
don't
doesn't,
have that.
yeah.
We don't have that. And if you want to convince people that your ethical compass is correct, because you're ultimately advocating that the government do stuff, and the government uses force to do stuff. That's how they accomplish things. Taxation they accomplish by force. It's or a threat of force at the very least. So if you're saying you have a moral argument for why it's okay for the government to use force against people, then what I'm saying is then make your case. Tell me how you're arriving at that conclusion. And you said a second ago, well, that's just my personal belief. But I don't think that we should be having the government use force against people based on Michael Mechanic's personal ethical belief.
No, that's right. I quote a guy in my book named Jeffrey Winters, who studies sort of uh, wealth and society all around the world. He said basically throughout history, wealth has accumulated in societies and then been protected. In the past, pre-government, it was protected by, oligarch types with private armies, essentially, the Medici, whatever, um, and who could basically used basically physical force to take and keep whatever they wanted. Now, we have organized our society to avoid that kind of thing, but to some degree, uh, putting government in place to protect those same interests, the interests of the very wealthy. Now you don't need a private army anymore, because if you can get the government to do it for you, and pass the laws that will protect your wealth.
But you're arguing that the government used the same amount of force just on the other side. You're actually not arguing that the government should be used in self-defense. You're arguing that the government should be used to extrapolate or to take wealth from people and to pass laws like minimum wage laws, and you're doing it based on an ethical judgment. And what I'm trying to get to is, what is that ethical judgment based on? Because if it's just based on you don't like it, then that's not acceptable to me. Now, if you've got an ethical argument for in a standard to judge by, well, then I'm open to listen. I
Well, I mean,
personally have a
literally,
standard.
like every major religion, if you want to talk about religion,
But
every
you said
major
religion
religion.
was out of it. You said we're not going by
Well, I
religion.
mean,
We
okay,
separate
yes, but
religion.
actually, our system was founded on values that have been always sort of part of religious ethics. And it's true that you don't mix church and state, but you can still have there are values that say you don't let one person feast while the other starves. I mean,
And that you
it's
should stone
look.
somebody
I
if he
mean,
works on the
should
Sabbath.
we be able to murder people? Right?
No,
I
no,
think
of course
we
not.
can all agree. So that's one of the
No,
commandments.
of course not.
Um,
But the reason I would say we shouldn't be able to murder people is because I would say this: an ethical code is ultimately a code of values that guides human behavior. A
right.
value is what morality is, and I would say values are objective. They're validated by reference to a standard. That standard is life, because life is what gives rise to value. And therefore, if my life is of value, I have a right to defend it. I have a right to sustain it. And if somebody initiates force against me, I have a right to retaliate. And I would say
But do
that
you think but if you are rich and powerful, is your life more valuable than somebody who's
no,
poor?
no, of course, no,
Right?
no, of course not. But here's the thing. Our government is supposed to be based on the idea that the government doesn't have any rights that aren't delegated to it by the people. Would you agree with
That's
that?
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you now, if I am hungry, or if my mother, well, she's not alive, but if my friend is sick, do I have a right to come and stick a gun in your face and rob you to pay to feed me or to put my friend to pay his hospital bills? And you're going to say, hell no. But if an individual doesn't have that right, and if the government only has rights delegated to it, then the government can't have that right. But that's what it does when it taxes.
The government has a right to tax because
how does it have a right to tax? You just said, I don't have a right to tax you. So how do they have a right to tax?
it's in the Constitution.
I
sir.
understand it's in the Constitution.
Yeah.
I'm saying that's wrong. What I'm saying is that you asked me earlier about a libertarian perspective. What I'm saying is the government has no rights that aren't delegated to it by people. An individual has no right to use force to get somebody to do something for him, to pay his
and we've
bills,
delegated
to
to our
lawn.
government the right
but how
to
can
tax.
but how can you delegate a right to a government if you don't have that right to begin with? And that's why I asked you for your ethical argument, because I figured I had a hunch that it was going to break down on this issue, because you conceded that I don't have the right to rob you to pay for things that I want. You conceded that the government doesn't have any rights not delegated to it by the people, but then you say the government does have a right to tax. That doesn't stand up to a very basic syllogism.
Well, I mean, if you accept that we should have a government, and it was agreed upon by the founders that it should be as such, right?
It was
I'm not
agreed upon
saying,
by a very small subset of the
well,
population at
okay,
that
so
time.
you would scrap the Constitution entirely.
If it were up to me, if you say, what is my personal belief, I would say that we should seriously amend the Constitution. I don't think it's all bad. And I think those aspects of it that provide for mutual self-defense are very good. And we should limit it to that. Because ultimately, the government does not have rights outside of rights that individuals have. And individuals do not have the right to take property from other people. They don't have the right to interfere in contracts between other people. They don't have the right to force people to
the
pay for others'
interaction
healthcare.
between just like personal finance, and this is used by politicians all the time to say, well, you have to balance your household budget, so the government should have to balance its budget. But the government works in a very, very different way than a household budget.
Sure, they can steal to make up for the deficit. I don't have that. That's
okay,
the point.
right.
I can't do
Right.
that.
I mean, like, okay, so I mean, libertarian views, they have some great aspects. But again, just like we don't live in a there's no pure capitalism here. There's no pure libertarianism either. I mean, where does that leave us?
No, but there's no pure. What you're advocating for change. You're saying that.
I'm just saying, if all we did was the libertarian view, just providing for the common defense.
Yes.
People, we're animals and we hoard resources. I mean, it's very instinctive. I think our altruistic instincts are a smaller slice, but by and large, people are motivated by accumulating wealth and power. We've seen that in this country. And even when you ask people what's important,
which is why, by the way, we shouldn't be giving power to the government. I'm sorry, Michael. I'm sorry. We're out of time. I would listen if you're willing to come back. I'd love to have you. I love the back and forth. I love the different viewpoints. I thank you very, very much for coming on.
Yeah,
where can people find you?
Where can they find me?
Yes.
Well, I write for Mother Jones, and I have a website. It's actually the easy shortcut is readjackpot.com. So if you're interested in the book,
and that's right behind you. And it's actually, I have it written here. It's Jackpot: How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. Listen, I recommend it. Read it, because whether you agree with it or not, it's good to get different viewpoints. Don't live in an echo chamber. Thank you very much, Michael, for being here. Everybody, like, subscribe, share. Till next time, this is the Rational Egoist signing off.